Romans chapter 3, verses 1 to 20. Then what's the advantage of being a Jew? Is there any value in the ceremony of circumcision? Yes, there are great benefits. First of all, the Jews were entrusted with the whole revelation of God. True, some of them were unfaithful, but just because they were unfaithful, does that mean God will be unfaithful? Of course not. Even if everyone else is a liar, God is true. As the scripture says about him, you will be proved right in what you say, and you will win your case in court. But, some may say, our sinfulness serves a good purpose, for it helps people see how righteous God is. Isn't it unfair, then, for him to punish us? This is merely a human point of view. Of course not. If God were not entirely fair, how would he be qualified to judge the world? But someone still might argue, how can God condemn me as a sinner if my dishonesty highlights his truthfulness and brings him more glory? And some people may even slander us by claiming that we say, the more we sin, the better it is. Those who say such things deserve to be condemned. Well then, should we conclude that we Jews are better than others? No, not at all. For we have already shown that all people, whether Jews or Gentiles, are under the power of sin. As the scripture says, no one is righteous, not even one. No one is truly wise. No one is seeking God. All have turned away. All have become useless. No one does good, not a single one. Their talk is foul, like the stench from an open grave. Their tongues are filled with lies. Snake venom drips from their lips. Their mouths are full of cursing and bitterness. They rush to commit murder. Destruction and misery always follow them. They don't know where to find peace. They have no fear of God at all. Obviously, the law applies to those to whom it was given, for its purpose is to keep people from having excuses and to show that the entire world is guilty before God. For no one can ever be made right with God by doing what the law commands. The law simply shows us how sinful we are. This is the word of the Lord.
Good morning. Wow, don't you wish you were preaching on those verses? The parable of the responsible older brother. A man had 2 sons. The younger son told his father, I want my share of your estate now, before you die. So the father agreed to divide his wealth between his sons. A few days later, this younger son packed all his belongings and moved to a distant land, and there he wasted all his money in wild living. About the time his money ran out, a great famine swept over the land, and he began to starve. He persuaded a local farmer to hire him, and the man sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. The young man became so hungry that even the pig food looked good to him. But no one gave him anything. Robin's hiding under the thing. When the younger brother finally came to his senses, he said to himself, at home, even the hired servants have food enough to spare, and here I am, dying of hunger. I will go home to my father and say, Father, I've sinned against both heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. So he returned home to his father, and while he was still a long way off, his father saw him coming and sighed and said to the servants, I thought this would happen. Clean out a room in the servants' quarters so that he's got somewhere to stay. Find some of his brother's old clothes for him to wear. Kill the calf we've been fattening. Go fetch Rob, who is working in the field. We must celebrate with a feast. I will reward my responsible son for slaving at home, never once refusing to obey and doing the right thing while his brother was off doing the wrong thing. For everything I own belongs to Rob. And Fib, my younger son, needs to understand the consequences of not doing the right thing. So the party began. From the servants' quarters, Fib, the youngest son, heard the music and dancing. He was very sad and he wouldn't go into the party. His father came out and invited him, but he refused, saying, "I'm now a hired servant. I've wasted your money on prostitutes and have sinned against both heaven and earth, heaven and you, and I'm no longer worthy to be called your son or attend Rob's party." And he continued to live his days as a hired servant. Dad and Rob came to be satisfied that Fib had realised the error of his ways and was making amends for the disgrace he had brought upon himself and the family. Here's a family portrait. Don't you love that smug little smile on Rob's face? Do you agree that if we're honest, there would be times when we'd feel far more comfortable with an ending like that? After all, isn't that what they both deserved? Rob is the faithful working servant getting what he deserves, and Fib, foolish younger brother, getting what he deserved. I call Rob because he's a responsible older brother. And I'm going to refer to the Rob attitude as I go through today. That is, no offence to you, Rob, but that is our responsible older brother attitude. And it's an awareness of this attitude in myself and other people that leads me to question what's behind the first couple of verses in Paul's passage. Then what's the advantage of being a Jew? Is there any value in the ceremony of circumcision? Who asks a question like that? Except if you're worried about what's in it for you. Paul, as if answering or reassuring a responsible older brother, says, yes, there are great benefits. First of all, the Jews were entrusted with the whole revelation of God. Wow. The actual word used here is the oracles of God. And this phrase emphasises that God's voice can still be heard as he continues to speak through these writings. And the word entrusted is there. Entrusted implies that you've been given something to look after for someone else. It's not for you. It's like the postman is entrusted with your mail. It's not for him. It's not a status symbol for him. It's not for him to glorify in. It's actually for someone else. And what God gave the Jews was actually for the world. And that blessing was to follow out to everybody else. Okay, we're still going. What you will see in a minute is a picture of Moses with the 10 Commandments. Yes, basically it's a 10-step program. We laugh, but it is. Nothing to glorify in, it's what it is. So Paul waits until chapter 9 of Romans to continue a list of why it's great to be a Jew. But now he follows the track of what the Jews have done with what they've been entrusted with. Their 10-step program, their oracles of God. Well, there it is again. There's a lesson in this somewhere, okay? There is a lesson, and this is my point. I'm not directing the technology. True, some of them were unfaithful, but just because they were unfaithful, does that mean God will be unfaithful? Of course not. Even if everyone else is a liar, God is true. As the scriptures say about him, you'll be proved right in what you say, and you will win your case in court. Sadly, the Jews hadn't been faithful to their faithful God. They kept the benefits to themselves. They'd used what they had to separate themselves from other nations and to justify what they were doing. They justified that separation because they were God's people. They didn't show the world what covenant people would look like. And the nations received a message about God, not who he was. They received a message about who he wasn't. But despite the faithlessness and responsible older brother attitude of his chosen people, God continues with his plan to reconcile the entire world. In a kind of double-layered way of looking at these things, if we inserted Christian into these Bible verses, it might be a really helpful thing. What has the church done with what we've been entrusted with? Just keep that in your mind as we go along, because we are no longer Jews who need to be convinced. But there's a timeless message here that's worth thinking through. Because, and I actually, whoop, there he is again. Will I just butt out and let you do it, Robin? I actually saw someone wearing this T-shirt last 2 weeks ago. However, we mightn't wear it on the outside, but I'm not sure how many of us at times wear it on the inside. So the text quotes Psalm 51, where it says, "You are worthy to judge." And those two lines that were there which said, "You will be proven right in what you say and you will win your case in court," are when King David realised, when he was confronted with the affair with Bathsheba, he stood before God, broken and honest, saying, "You're right, I'm wrong. You are in a place to judge." It took a long time of covering up and lying to get him there, but he eventually got to that point. So you can see, and I'm calling it the pig pen moment, which is, and I don't know why the pig pen keeps coming up, but that's what I'm talking. David reached his pig pen moment and realised God was able to judge. But some might say, went on to the next Bible verse, our sinfulness serves a good purpose, for it helps people see how righteous God is. This is merely a human point of view. Of course not. If God were not entirely fair, how would he be qualified to judge the world? But someone might still argue, how can God condemn me as a sinner if my dishonesty highlights his truthfulness and brings him more glory? And some people even slander us by claiming we say the more we sin, the better it is. Those who say such things deserve to be condemned. See, part of the scandalous nature of grace is it's open to being taken advantage of and misinterpretation. What would your response be to Rob, right? So Rob's been faithfully working in the field. He's seen Fib getting away with so much, and in the real story, he comes back and he's forgiven, right? So Rob says, well, why should Fib have all the fun? If Dad's that much of a pushover, why don't I go and start visiting some local establishments? It'll make Dad look better. What would you say? Because that's the logic that's coming out here, and that's the logic that we hear in our society and at times in the church. Well, if it's that easy, if grace is free, well, I'll just do what I like. But what does that do to the Father's heart? Yes, it's free, and what about Dad? That was on an atheist website. You can almost hear Paul exploding. Such people deserve to be condemned. Not the atheists, but the people who believe that. So all people are sinners. Now, look, I don't know whether you're tired of hearing this, because you've actually been through a few weeks of Romans, and it just seems to be that Paul just keeps going on and on about sin. I didn't come to church today for someone to make me feel bad, right? I am tired of being called a sinner. Well, obviously Paul thinks that the message hasn't quite gotten through, that nobody has yet reached their pig pen moment. So he continues. Well then, should we conclude that Jews are better than others? No, not at all. Insert Christians there. For we have already shown that all people, whether Jews or Gentiles, are under the power of sin. Now, when we say under the power of sin, it means like a slave who's completely controlled by a master. So sin isn't just something you do. It's almost as though it's got a life of its own. And if we're honest, we admit that that's the case. So it's not a wrongdoing, it's a power under that we can't escape from. And as the scriptures say, no one is righteous, not even one. The word righteous here is a legal term. It means standing right before God. It describes our status before God, our Creator and Judge. And in other words, no one in their own merit can stand before God. I can remember when my kids were teenagers, I'd chip one of them for something and they'd say, "Oh, you don't realise how good you've got it." And I'd say, of course, "Well, thank you for reminding me. I'd forgotten I was parenting saints." And in the back of my mind, I'm saying, you should meet some of the parents I know. But that wouldn't have been helpful to me or to them. Let me illustrate this in another way. Now, just imagine that your sin, instead of being concealed on the inside, was actually on the outside. And it was visible to everybody that you mixed with. Oh, look at her sin. It's all over her face. Wouldn't we be different at church? Wouldn't we be different out in the real world? But imagine this scenario. I attempt to enter a fancy restaurant. I'm greeted at the front desk by a particularly polite staff member who says, "Excuse me, madam, you've got something on your face. You'll need to remove it before you enter." And I say, "I have not. I've got nothing on my face." He stands there. I'm a professional. Professionals don't have stuff on their faces. Anyway, who do you think you are? I've seen people with much more on their faces. Have you looked around? Have you looked at your face? And right now, your face is looking down on me with this kind of know-it-all smirk, and I don't appreciate it. After I'm handed a mirror and I can see it, well, if you'd grown up in a family like mine, you'd have stuff on your face too. There are people with worse stuff on their faces. I don't look that bad. Hasn't everyone got a little stuff on their face? After all, we're all human. If my mother didn't make me eat like she did, I wouldn't have stuff on my face. If my boss didn't rush me, I wouldn't have stuff on my face. And if God didn't make my face, well, I wouldn't have stuff on it. I'd like to think we're laughing because this is all completely new. We've never ever heard this sort of justification, denial, blaming before. There's something deep within us, and whether it's shame, whether it's pride, that says, I don't need a doctor, I'm not sick, and I don't want to be helped. Paul is so convicted that the Jews do need help and what they stand to lose that he keeps going on about their rob attitude. He wants them to get to their pig pen moment. So he uses a technique called pearl stringing, where he joins little gems from the Old Testament to make a point. So he gets verses. It's like the Jews are in court, and he calls King David and the prophet Isaiah to witness. So these verses, although they're quite hard to understand, all come from different Psalms and Isaiah. If I had time, I'd go through them all. But these accusations from their own respected scriptures point out a truth. So I'm going to go through what those things say. So it's about sin. So just nudge the person next to you, because chances are I'm talking about them. And just make sure they're listening. He talks about those other person's minds that get so confused that they don't see reality as it is. So sin affects minds. Sin affects motives, so that people chase things other than God. What does that person next to you chase instead of God? Sin affects wills. That is, those people next to you and around you want to choose their own path instead of following God. Sin affects tongues, mouths, and it's so graphic. Their talk is foul and filled with lies. Snake venom drips from their lips. Oh my goodness. Must be those other people, right? Because none of our words are like that. Sin affects our relationships, and effectively stomping on each other after each other's blood. Maybe not literally, but we don't know God's peace because of sin. Now that sounds like doom and gloom. However, in preparing, I read all those passages in full, and each one of them is framed in a context of getting to the end of that point and realising that God is going to do something. So if you get a chance, and most Bibles, or if you go online, have got the verses, the footnotes, from where those came from, and it will tell you. You can read all of those in full and see the promises at the end of those texts. The promise is that we're helpless before evil, and God will keep his covenant. Okay, so, and the next verse goes on to say they have no fear of God at all. And I like what Tim Keller says about fear. He says, fear of God is a central concept in the Bible. Not servile, cringing fear of punishment. It's an inner attitude of awe, respect, and sober, trembling joy. Obviously, the law applies to those for whom it was given. For its purpose is that every mouth may be stopped, and to show the entire world is guilty before God. So that's on the next slide. And in Paul's world, if you were on trial and you'd presented your case, you put your hand over your mouth to say that you'd reached the end of your evidence. If other people had thought you had reached the end of your evidence and you were not going to prove your innocence, they would stop your mouth. And that's what they did in the time of Jesus when they whipped him on the mouth. So the audience Paul was talking to would have been more familiar with the local customs in court. And verse 20 says, "For no one can ever be made right with God by doing what the law commands. The law simply shows us how sinful we are." So the conduct of Rob and Fib was worlds apart. I wonder if their hearts were incredibly similar. Neither feared God in a way that inspired, their dad, in a way that inspired reverence for his position. Both were self-centered and wanting a relationship on their own terms. The good deeds of Rob conformed to what was right in practice but not in motive. And Tim Keller sums it up this way. And I have got that on the slide. It's back a bit, I think. Did I miss that? The main difference between a Christian and a religious person is not so much their attitude to their sins, but their attitude toward their good deeds. Both will repent of their sins, but only Christians will repent of wrongly motivated good works, while the religious person will rely on them. Ooh. I did recognise a few other people when I read that. Feeding the hungry, caring for the sick, being honest at work can only be a gift to God. If I do it to get God's favour and salvation, I'll be smug. If I fail, then I'm going to get worried and I'm going to feel sorry for myself. When I look at the story, the real story of the prodigal son, I see a father waiting. I see a father forgiving even before there's any confession. I read a blog that says, why has the parable got no ending? Why don't we find out what happens to the older son? And his answer was that because the audience to which he was speaking mainly recognised with Rob, and that quite possibly Rob is a myth. There is no Rob. The only action in that story is for Rob to realise he's just another foolish young brother. It's like there is no... Oh, I better not say that. There's children. That other dude that we find out, he's a myth. One of the main truths of the parable of the prodigal son is that everyone is lost. Just some of us haven't woken up to it yet. Are we going to come into the party? He says religion is an invisible prison. It makes us think we're okay when we're not. We may actually be further from him than the greatest of sinners. Sinners typically know they're sinning. Religious people never do. The party will always be for the person who realises that they've screwed up. And logically, Rob will get a party when he realises. In the early 1900s, the London Times had a correspondent who ended many of his articles with the words, "What is wrong with the world today?" Finally, in response, G.K. Chesterton, a well-known Christian writer and apologist, wrote the following reply to the paper. "Dear editor, what's wrong with the world? I am. Faithfully yours, G.K. Chesterton." Why has it taken Paul 3 chapters to tell us exactly that? Probably because they were like us, defensive people with our older brother attitude, who failed to realise their need for what God had to offer, who hadn't yet reached their pig pen moment. What is it that causes me to be so defensive? To tell God and say sorry for something he actually already knows? See, I squirm and I wriggle and I pretend and I defend when it's actually very obvious for him to see what I've done and he loves me. And my own experience is that when I finally come to God and tell him I'm sorry, I don't meet with judgment and condemnation, I meet with freedom. Why is it so hard? And why do we consider that a once-off thing when it's an everyday walk? And Peter talked about the gospel being a path, not a once-off thing. It's not as hard as I think. And as a parent, waiting for a child to come home, what does God want? And how is God going to treat us when we do? I want to be someone who is endlessly correctable by God, Thomas Merton said. I need to come to God because I've missed the mark, so I can be free of my religious prison and continue to live the gospel. I need it to show grace to other people so that my Rob attitude doesn't show. Because my Rob attitude will never draw other people to a loving God. And I tell you what, with what's coming up in our country and in our world, more and more, our world needs people of Jesus who've had their pig pen moment and who remember what it was like to be with the pigs.